Jenny. I'm president of the forum. And just as a reminder, we are asking that you all keep your masks on for the duration of the program. We are very happy to be back here at Hotchkiss School in this beautiful auditorium for the program with our constitutional scholar and Yale Law School professor, Akil Amar. The Constitution, I think, is on top of many of our minds as we recuperate from the midterm elections, absorb the multiple investigations into the assault on the Capitol, January 6, 2021, and ponder the implications of dramatic decisions in the federal courts. The Salisbury Forum's mission is to present programs that explore important topics for our country and for this community, bringing a diverse array of thoughtful scholars, journalists, and authors who present a point of view, a new perspective, or some deep knowledge on a particular topic for our local audience. We're supported by you and a handful of businesses and institutions, and your generous support allows us to offer these programs to the public at no charge. So we're asking that you please take note of our annual appeal letters, which will be going out next week. Send us a check, or if you'd like, go to our website, salisburyforum.org, where you can pay via PayPal or stock contributions if you would like. This is actually our final program of 2022, but coming right up in the new year, we are very excited to be showing a documentary film called A Vow from Hiroshima at the Millerton Movie House on Sunday morning, January 15th, which is the Martin Luther King holiday weekend. This film is a very dramatic story of Setsuko Thuro, who at 13 years old in 1945, was 13 in 1945 when the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. She was pulled from the fiery rubble of a building in which 27 of her classmates perished. Setsuko then went on to fight for decades in a campaign to get a treaty banning nuclear weapons, which was actually adopted in 2017 at the United Nations and led to a Nobel Peace Prize for the campaign. We will have the film director and writer, whose mother and grandfather also survived the Hiroshima bombings, who will be joining us for Q&A after the film. So please watch for details on this program. And let's turn to the introduction of our speaker this evening. Akhil Amar is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law. And as we learned at dinner with him, constitutional law is his subject. He knows it deeply, probably more than almost any other American. After graduating from Yale College and Yale Law School and clerking for then Judge, now Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, Amar joined the Yale faculty in 1985 at age 26. He is Yale's only currently active professor to have won what the university calls its Triple Crown: the Sterling Chair for Scholarship, the Devane Medal for Teaching, and the Lamar Award for Alumni Service. Many of you now have in your hands his most recent book, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. The popular approval of the Constitution in 1788 was the culmination of 30 years of passionate argument over the nature of government. And as we all know, those arguments have continued ever since. In The Words That Made Us, Akil Reed's account of the document's origins and consolidation is a guide for any of us who are seeking to understand the Constitution today. I have to say that one might expect a scholar such as Akil to be remote and unapproachable. On the contrary, Akil Amar answers his own phone, or at least he did this summer when we called to see if he would be interested in speaking at a Salisbury Forum after 5 years. He was here in 2017. And he was so generous with his time as we figured out how to purchase these books for all of you rather than pay him an honorarium. His one request is that we all read at least the first chapter, which I think is many pages longer than most first chapters. The Salisbury Forum has a couple of speakers who have come back and spoken twice, but only one has returned 6 times. This is Akil Reed Amar's 6th visit, so please join me in welcoming him to the Salisbury.
Well, it's great to be back, and we made it through last week, all of us. And here's what I mean by that. We held an election on time with remarkably few irregularities. People showed up in large numbers. All generations showed up. That includes younger Americans who haven't always participated in what they call off-year elections. I don't know what that means, off-year. It's an election. You're filling the entire House of Representatives. That seems like an on-year. People from all parts of the country, all political persuasions, showed up. We're still counting and in some places carefully recounting, but we're doing so within the rules and peacefully. This is not something to be taken for granted. It's something to be approached with a kind of awe. People who ran the elections are not just paid professional officials, but volunteers from every part of the spectrum in every town and hamlet and cities, of course, in the country. Your neighbors volunteered to observe these events and to participate in them as election officials and observers. So where does all that come from? Now today, you might take it for granted, but let's go back to the 1770s and 80s. At the time of the American Revolution and the American Constitution, which is what my new book is about, that era, democracy basically has existed in very few places in the history of planet Earth, in very few periods. In the 1770s and 80s, who else basically governs themselves with free and fair elections? The Brits, to some extent, although they have a king no one voted for, still do. You have a House of Lords no one voted for. They still have a vestigial House of Lords. But they have elections plus or minus in the 1770s and 80s. So some self-governance. They've got jury trials to a certain extent. So you got the Brits. You got the Swiss. And the Swiss, truthfully, they have more sheep than people. But they do have elections, so good for them. The Dutch are in the process of losing their self-governance, and that's it for planet Earth. And you go back across the centuries, back into the recesses of time, and there's, as I said, very little self-government in very few places. The history of the world is the history of kings, emperors, czars, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chieftains, thugs all. Okay? And then we, the people of the United States, come on the scene and we enact a revolution, we declare our independence, we adopt state constitutions and an Articles of Confederation, and then a federal constitution, followed by a Bill of Rights. That's the story that occupies the first half, really, of this massive tome that many of you have just picked up. But today you might say, okay, fine, we once did something pretty singular in the world. We put a constitution to a vote up and down the continent. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But today, there are democracies in other places, so what's the big deal? Why should we see this with such awe and reverence? And here's why. Because most of the other democracies in the world are not multicultural the way ours is. And it's harder because we Americans don't have as much in common as many of the other societies. We don't have a common language the way the French do, or the Germans. We don't have one ethnicity, one race. We span multiple time zones and climactic zones. Our counterpart is not France or Germany. It would be all of Europe. So what do we have in common? Not geography quite, not politics, to be sure, not, there's north and south, and east and west, and coastal, and heartland, this is not language, not religion, not ethnicity. Some of our families came over yesterday from somewhere else in the world. Others came over hundreds of years ago. Some with bullwhips in their hands, others in chains. We're almost the only nation in the world where the great-great-grandchildren of all the other peoples of the world come together. So that's going to be a more challenging project, you see, than the one faced by the Germans or the Swedes or the French. So what do we have in common then? What holds us together? And my claim is that what holds us together more than anything else is this thing called the Constitution of the United States. And it's short and you can read it, and you should. And behind it, and that's almost the only thing that holds us together, with the exception of the story behind it, our national narrative, a saga that travels through things like the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, Lincoln is saying that about 1776. He's thinking about the Declaration, not just the Constitution. So there's the text, the supreme law of the land, that governs us all, Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, red and blue, and the story behind it. And if you don't know that story, it's just very hard to be an American and to coordinate your behavior with everyone else on this continent. So every 4 years, we have to pick a president. How are you going to do that if you don't know who the presidents have been and who's been good and who's been bad by your lights? We're the hiring committee. We're the ones who are doing the drafting for the team. And if you don't know which quarterbacks have been good and which are not so good, or who really deserves the MVP this year, and I could walk out in this hall or just about any hall in America, and people could actually converse intelligently about the MVP, or it was just announced recently, you may have heard, for the American League, or how Tom Brady compares to the greats of the past, whether you're talking about Peyton Manning or Joe Montana or Bart Starr or whatever, and most of you know what I'm talking about here, But if you don't know your presidents, how are you going to pick the next one? And who was good and who was bad? You see, but you're like, if you don't know your history, you're like a person who has amnesia. Suppose you woke up tomorrow and you didn't remember who you were, who your spouse was, who your children are, your siblings, your friends. You would be utterly lost. If collectively we suffer from this amnesia, we don't know who we have been, we don't know then where we are and where we should be going. All of which is to say that, and this is my utterly self-serving thought, that you all have to read the book. Because I had to write it. It took me a long time to write it, but it's not going to do any good unless you read it. You know, I see it myself as a kind of virus, you see, and I got to infect you. I've got to somehow get inside you. You don't have to agree with what I have to say, but I think I want you to actually know your constitutional saga. This book, The Words That Made Us, is the first of three. It's a pun, the word that made the U.S., how we become a we. The subtitle is America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. At the beginning of my book, there's not an us, there's not a we. There are a series of discrete colonies who happen to have a common allegiance to a crown, but not much, they don't have much in common with each other. They happen to be contiguous, but that fact aside, they're not much more of a we than, let's say, in 1930. We're talking a lot about the crown these days, and meaning the TV series and the thing that Charles III is going to put on his head. And in 1930, 1935, when his late mother, Elizabeth II, is a little girl. So you look out in the world, and there's Kenya, and Canada, and Ireland, and New Zealand, and Australia, what do they have in common? India. Not much except a common allegiance to a British crown. Well, that's America, what we call America in 1760. When my book starts, there's Massachusetts and New York and South Carolina, and they're distinct colonies established at different times for different purposes by different sorts of folks, and they have a common allegiance to Britain and not much else in common. That's the beginning of my book. And I tell the story, beginning in 1760, which is earlier than most people begin the story, of how we become a we. Through ultimately a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. And the story takes you through the first 80 years. I begin with a little phrase, the first 40, with a tip of the hat to Lincoln, the first 80 years. America's constitutional conversation, we become a we by talking to each other and listening to each other, you see, and doing things constitutionally. We become a we in this period. That's 1760 to 1840. Volume 2, if I live long enough, will be The Words That Made Us Equal. America's Constitutional Conversation, 1840 to 1920. All about how women become a big part of the conversation. The book is going to end with women's suffrage everywhere in 1920. How blacks are going to achieve equality. We're going to go from a regime of slavery to a regime of black civil and political equality everywhere in America. How did that happen? The Words That Made Us Equal tells the story of the next 40 years. And then the third volume, if I live long enough, will be The Words That Made Us Modern, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1920 to 2000. So 3 80-year sagas, big fat books, telling the story of America from the Revolution through Reagan from a constitutional lens, through a constitutional lens. So that's the project. And my grand plan for world domination is that you'll read the books and discover what you have in common with your fellow Americans, which is the constitutional story, and you're going to be able to take it forward in the right way. Once you know who you are, where you came from, you may have a better sense of where we are going. I'm going to read a couple of passages from the book, and then I'm going to take your questions. It could be about the founding period. It could be about other moments in the American constitutional saga. It could be about stuff in the headlines today. And I just want to begin by persuading you that all sorts of things that you think you know, maybe you don't know. My friend Derek is up at the computer desk. This first painting, it's by a guy from Connecticut, John Trumbull. It's about the Declaration of Independence. So And just shout it out. When did America, what's the day on which America declares its independence?
July 2nd.
Yeah, that's right. It's July 2nd, not July 4th. It was a trick question. How many of you actually knew it was July 2nd? Okay, you were very knowledgeable. And how many, truth be told, not? There you go. What happened on July 4th then? Fireworks, yes, there we go. So what happened on July 4th? No. Okay, some people, this looks like a signing ceremony. It was signed over the course of a summer, and they were never all together like this.
They read
They,
it.
close. They voted for a piece of paper called the Declaration of Independence. They declared their independence on July 2nd, and they announced some reasons in a piece of paper called the Declaration on July 4th. This depicts actually a slightly different moment when the 5-person committee of detail, including a guy from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, presents their draft. And you can see John Adams right in the middle. He's the only one you see head to toe. And you see Thomas Jefferson, his hands are on the document. You see old Ben Franklin. And you also see Roger Sherman and Livingston. Folks up and down the continent. But it didn't happen that way. Bunch of people are in that picture who weren't there when the 5-man committee of detail actually presents the document. And other people who were there, they're not depicted because John Trumbull didn't have a good likeness of them. So, he's taking poetic license here. So what really happened versus what gets remembered as happening, not always the same thing. And this, I tell a little bit of that story in chapter 1. And when we flash forward to the Constitution, some of the things that you were taught, not quite true perhaps. The details I just gave you don't matter so much, but the details on the Constitution are going to matter quite a lot if you get your story wrong about what happened and what didn't happen and why and how. But let me first, just since I have this picture up there, just tell you a little bit about, I'm going to read to you for maybe 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes, about the Declaration of Independence. If law, to be fully legitimate, must take some account of the views whom it seeks to rule, what about American women in 1776? What about indigenous peoples, referred to by the Declaration as, quote, merciless savages, unquote? What about American slaves and American slavery? The status of women, Indians, and slaves will structure much of America's constitutional conversation in the decades to come. We shall thus return to these questions in future chapters, which is why I want you to read not just chapter 1, but the whole book, you see. For now, as we focus especially on the moments of decision in 1776, here's my first key point. We should note that on none of these issues were the British better than the Americans. Moreover, Americans had strong answers, unhypocritical answers, answers that were genuinely defensible given the world they inherited and sought to remake on women and Native Americans. On slavery, however, the Declaration hypocritically sacrificed justice and truth, self-evident truth at that, on the altar of self-interest, unity, and military expediency. So I'm going to tell you the story of women and slaves. I'm going to skip over the Native American story, but you can read it in the book. And if you want to follow along, I'm reading from page 186 and following in this massive tome that many of you now have. So women didn't vote, yet they were taxed by colonial assemblies and will continue to be taxed by new state governments in independent America. Many other legal impositions would also be heaped upon these non-voters. How could any of this be squared with the Declaration's principles? Because the Brits were right in some ways. Sometimes virtual representation could indeed protect non-voters, as the Brits had insisted in the years leading up to the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, American male voters plausibly saw themselves as virtual representatives of the women in their lives, their wives, daughters, sisters, and mothers. Now here's the next key point. American women themselves were not yet, claiming otherwise. They were not petitioning American men the way the colonists had petitioned the king and parliament. They were not writing women's suffrage essays, convening feminist or feminine assemblies, organizing all female committees of correspondence, engaging in female civil disobedience, boycotting men, or doing any of the things that patriots were doing to dramatize and explain their sense of aggrievement toward Britain. This apparent quiescence would not last. Mid-19th century American women would indeed proliferate petitions for women's equality, pen and print suffragist books and essays, convene pro-women assemblies, organize feminist boycotts, and do much, much more. And when they did, they would in fact brilliantly echo and adapt the very language of the Declaration of Independence itself, and iconic statements such as the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1848. So that's why I got it right, and I'm going to want you to read Volume 2, The Words That Made Us Equal. So stay tuned. Women in the 1760s and 1770s were, of course, participants in the great debate between Britain and America. Patriot daughters of liberty made homespun and brewed indigenous teas to support boycotts. Loyalist women tried to stiffen the spines of their spouses. Once war broke out, women on both sides of the contest often manned their households, freeing up men to fight on battlefields. That said, many revolutionary women, from Patriot Betsy Ross, who sewed a flag, to loyalist Peggy Shipman Arnold, who whispered sweet things to her husband Benedict and bamboozled Washington and Hamilton with fake hysteria, played highly gendered roles. The major pamphlets, essays, orations, and the like of the era came from men as men. The most pointed discussion of the rights of women came from the era's shrewdest political espouse, and it came notably in a private letter to her husband. The letter is now famous, but it was not published until the mid-19th century. On March 31st, 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to John that, quote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency," unquote. Then she pivoted. And by the way, whenever my wife says that to me, I know I'm in trouble. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That's the quote. Abigail began here by reminding John, Abigail is really cool. Abigail began here by reminding John that she wholeheartedly supported his crusade for American independence. I long to hear that you've declared an independence. They were in this together. John could never have left home for Philadelphia without Abigail's unwavering support. With good reason did John think that he virtually represented Abigail. He enjoyed talking politics with his wife, and conversed far better with Abigail than the king and his various ministers did with American patriots. So John Adams is always, telling Abigail in these letters all sorts of fun stuff, and the king isn't even listening to the American petitions. He won't let them be read in his presence. What specifically was Abigail asking John to do in this letter? Not to support women's suffrage, or even equal rights to women to own property, make contracts, publish newspapers, or do anything of the sort. Rather, and this is clear from other letters and additional context, Abigail was arguing that independent America should reform marriage laws to eliminate ancient English common law powers of husbands to physically discipline their spouses, what the common law referred to as a husband's power of, quote, domestic chastisement and moderate correction, what Americans today would describe as spouse abuse. In Abigail's words, quote, "That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness." In his epistolary response to Abigail, John missed the force of Abigail's point. John was not always a gifted listener. She countered briefly, but based on the tenor of the hundreds of extant letters between John and Abigail, one suspects that she may well have communicated her more detailed views to him in person on some later occasion. She was not one to hold back, and he genuinely loved conversing with his extraordinarily clever and articulate spouse, who in much of their back and forth wore the affectionate nickname Portia, as in The Merchant of Venice. Okay, so that's a little excerpt on sex. I'm going to skip my section on Native Americans and tell you a little bit about slaves. I wrote this excerpt before a lot of attention to what's now called the 1619 Project, but this is my take on the 1619 Project. If all men were truly created equal, how could some men own other men and own their yet unborn progeny unto the last generation? If life and liberty were unalienable rights, how could slavery be lawful or legitimate in the deepest sense of these words? There were no principled answers to these obvious questions, which laid bare the basic contradiction at the core of the Declaration and of Thomas Jefferson's convoluted contortions. Masters did not virtually represent the best interests of slaves the way John genuinely and plausibly understood himself to virtually represent Abigail, and Abigail, you see, agreed. Slaves thirsted for freedom and ached to win it whenever and however possible. Newspapers teemed with ads offering rewards for the capture of runaways. Colonists themselves obviously understood all this and more when they referred routinely to objectionable British policies as tantamount to slavery. Nor did slaves constitute some different sovereign or quasi-sovereign entity like, say, the Mohawk or the Oneida or the Seneca. See, Native Americans, it's a different thing. They're kind of hostile nations. They've sided with America's enemies in war, so there's some complexities there. Slaves, by contrast, spoke the same language and lived in the same cities, towns, and counties, and the same buildings sometimes as their masters. They were part of the same civilization, and they surely were in daily conversation with masters and the agents of masters. The explanation for the beam in the Declaration's eyes, biblical reference, was geostrategic. To defeat the British would require the unity of all 13 mainland colonies. Franklin's snake, the join or die snake, famous cartoon, could not be divided. Unity meant agreement from South Carolina, in particular. And the South Carolinians were so wedded to slavery as the basis of their society that they were not even willing to discuss the institution in the 1776 Congress. Quote, "If it's debated whether slaves are our property," declared South Carolina Delegate Thomas Lynch Jr., "there is an end of the Confederation. You even start talking about this, we're walking. And then we're going to side with the Brits, and then the Brits are going to have a base in the mainland, and they'll be able to slice and dice the rest of you." Franklin's serpent had quite a sting in the tail, as it turns out. The tail end is South Carolina and Georgia, the famous snake, join or die. Thus was born a basic contradiction between what Americans professed at their best and what they practiced at their worst. As finally adopted, the Declaration's text muted the contradiction. The document assailed King George for, quote, "exciting domestic insurrections amongst us," that is, slave revolts, but said no more. In an earlier draft, Jefferson had passionately condemned the international and domestic slave trade, though not quite slavery itself, and had tried to blame the British for introducing and imposing the slave trade on America. And then I have this long, convoluted quote from the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, blaming the Brits for all this. You know, just like your kids blame you for, what they've done. Yes, some of you are nodding your heads. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. Because the king and parliament had not generally prevented masters from freeing their own slaves. The master's own greed prevented that. Nor had the king and parliament mandated that Americans buy and sell slaves domestically. If Americans could voluntarily refrain from buying black tea, why not black slaves? Jefferson's effort to shift blame away from himself and other masters was clumsy and confused, and Congress wisely excised the entire passage. So far you might think, oh, I'm with the 1619 crowd. Well, only up to a point, you see, because remember what I told you before, on every issue, the Brits are worse. They're never any better, and that's your choice in 1776, Americans or the Brits. British critics sneered at the hypocrisy of American patriots in the 1770s. The classic line came from a 1775 pamphlet, Taxation No Tyranny, by the ever-quotable Samuel Johnson. Quote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" It was a great put-down, a brilliant proto-tweet from a distinguished Englishman whose opposition to slavery was sincere and abiding. But in the end, the last laugh was on Samuel Johnson himself, who in this reactionary pamphlet obtusely defended all sorts of tyrannical British measures. Johnson, notwithstanding, the British Empire in 1776 was every bit as steeped in slavery as were the mainland colonies. The West Indies were even worse than South Carolina. That's saying something. True, in November 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to certain runaway slaves. The specific gravamen of the Declaration is grievous about royal incitement of domestic insurrections. How many of you have heard of Dunmore's proclamation, by the way? It's a big 1619 meme. Okay. But the cynicism of Dunmore's gambit was obvious on close inspection. Only slaves of rebels, not loyalists, would be freed, and only if they served His Majesty's armed forces, fleeing from one servitude to another. More generally, this is the big point now, we must distinguish between freeing individual slaves, even many of them, and ending slavery as a system. Emancipation, also described as manumission, was not the same as abolition. Dunmore never proposed abolition, nor had any other British official or entity. Most contemporaneous and previous regimes in world history had allowed slavery of some sort. Few governments in the history of the world had ever adopted a sweeping and enduring ban on all forms of unfreedom. Slavery is practiced among Native American tribes in Asia and in Africa itself. So it doesn't begin in 1619, it's basically the world. No major, and nowhere is there abolition. No major British organization prior to 1775 had advocated for complete abolition. But in 1775, there arose a remarkable civic society that aimed to end slavery itself. Not just free slaves, but end slavery. The society was formed not by Samuel Johnson, nor in Johnson's vaunted London, nor indeed anywhere in Britain proper, but rather in Philadelphia, the host city of the Continental Congress. Two of the society's early leaders were Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, who both in the summer of 1776 added their names to the American Declaration of Independence. The Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, that's the title, was founded in Philadelphia in April 1775, same month as Lexington and Concord. The outbreak of war interrupted its activities. In 1780, thanks in part to its members, revolutionary Pennsylvania enacted a legal plan of partial emancipation and complete, albeit gradual, abolition. In 1787, the organization renamed itself, long name here, the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage and for Improving the Condition of the African Race, unquote. Benjamin Franklin became its president, Benjamin Rush its secretary. Well, so it's complicated, but it's not quite the 1619 story that you hear. Okay, that's 1776. Now I'm going to read you just 3 more minutes about 1787-88, the U.S. Constitution, and then whatever questions you want to ask, have at me. So let's see here. I'm just going to keep that picture on the screen. Depending on the questions you ask me, I may ask my friend Derek to show you some other pictures. Here's the thing about 1776. As extraordinary as it wasn't put to a popular vote. None of the ancient democracies, there weren't very many that existed, were enacted in democratic fashion. None of them basically had a written text that everyone could read and then vote on before the thing would go into operation. So that didn't happen in Pericles in Athens. It didn't happen in the Roman Republic. It didn't happen in Magna Carta. Magna Carta is not even written in English. No one can understand it, and it's not a composite of all the fundamental principles in Britain. Declaration is not put to a vote. U.S. Constitution is going to be put to a vote, you see. Let me just read you a couple of pages. This is from a later chapter, page 225, 227, and then let's talk. It's a chapter called People, as in we the people. The year-long debate over the Philadelphia Convention's proposal took the rising system of America's constitutional conversation to its highest level yet. More participants than ever before in world history tightly focused on a clearly defined constitutional question. Do we ordain and establish, or don't we? And directly engaged each other in multiple and intersecting ways, in newspapers, in coffee houses and taverns, in face-to-face public ratification debates, in correspondence and elsewhere, with words and pictures both simple and complex. The composite facts and figures are astonishing, and they are worth summarizing and savoring before we examine the process close up. First, on the number of elections. The Philadelphia proposal aimed to come before an entire continent for a two-step vote in each of the 13 states, 26 proposed contests in all. In the initial step, voters in each state would select delegates to a special, single-purpose ratifying convention with full foreknowledge of the specific plan on the continental agenda. In the next step, delegates in each convention would discuss the plan in detail, face-to-face, issue by issue, in full public view, with newspapermen in attendance before saying yay or nay. Second, on the breadth of voter and delegate eligibility. In 8 of the 13 states, ordinary property qualifications were lowered or eliminated for this special ratification process, allowing more persons than usual to vote, or more persons than usual to seek election in its conventions, or both. For example, in New York waived its standard voting rules, and for the first time in history, these are special rules, for the first time in history, allowed all adult, free, male citizens to vote. No race tests, no property tests, no religious tests, no literacy tests. Those are not the ordinary rules. Those are the rules for this special Jubilee year, once in a forever constitutional moment. 2 other states, so 8 of the 13 lowered qualifications compared to the ordinary rules. 2 other states followed standing voting rules that routinely allowed virtually all tax-paying adult male citizens to vote. So that's 10 of the 13. No state followed stricter suffrage rules than usual, rules that allowed free blacks to vote in most states, even most slave states. Never in American history, never in world history, had so many persons enjoyed the right to vote on any single question, much less the question of how they and their posterity would be governed. This is the big bang of human history, the hinge of human history. This is what changes the world. It's astonishing, and most Americans don't know it, and they're not teaching this in high schools today because they're teaching Howard Zinn crap. Oh, I'm going to tell you what I really think. Third, on the breadth and depth of conversation. When the Philadelphia Convention released the document on September 17, 1787, nearly every newspaper in America rushed to print in full the proposal's 4,500 words. The American Constitution is an interaction between written constitutions and written newspapers. You can't have one without the other, and today we're losing our newspapers, you see. Okay, so nearly every newspaper in America, rushed to print in full the proposal's 4,500 words. It's not short so that judges can make shit up. That's not why it's short. It's short so that ordinary people could read the damn thing and reread it and decide whether they were for it or against it. That's why it's short. At least 6 print shops in Philadelphia alone published the complete text within the first few days. Over the next several weeks, republication in full occurred in dozens of other cities and towns, including in chronological order of initial publication. You can just now imagine the ships going out from Philadelphia and the riders on their horses and going out to spread the word. So you can actually see who gets the word first, because sea travel is sometimes a little faster than land travel. So here's the initial order publication from Philadelphia. New York, Baltimore, Boston, New Haven, Elizabeth, Carlisle, Frederick, Providence, Richmond, Alexandria, Annapolis, Worcester, Norwich, New London, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Hartford, Middletown, Litchfield, Bennington, Charleston, Salem, Poughkeepsie, Northampton, Newburyport, New Bern, Portland, Pittsburgh, Newport, Fredericksburg, and Windsor. Over the ensuing year, Americans along a 1,000-mile stretch directly conversed with each other as never before, and did so because it mattered. Newspaper essayists jousted with each other conversationally, with repeated rounds back and forth in tight temporal sequence. That would be like the Federalist Papers. I'm sure newspaper essays you see. Delegates in ratifying conventions likewise conversed on countless points, large and small, and did so in public with the newspapers watching, you see. Many actually listened as well as spoke. What a concept. Some openly changed their minds and their votes during these conversations. Oh my God. In astonishing contrast to prior violent episodes, which I talk about early in the book, and you have to read it, of course. The Hutchinson riot, the Boston massacre, the multiple instances of colonial-era tarring and feathering, the general intimidation of loyalists, many of whom ultimately fled America, and of course the unspeakable carnage of the Revolutionary War. In contrast to all of that, almost no one was killed or maimed in political struggle during the fateful year of constitutional ratification. Even as tempers flared and passions raged, because the stakes were enormous, Americans conversed but did not combat. Shame on us for January 6, 2021. Shame on us. The losers in this conversation were not bullied into submission or forced into exile. Rather, anti-federalists, the name given the naysayers, were listened to. Some of their smartest concerns found their way into the Constitution's first round of amendments, what we call the Bill of Rights. Because people said, dudes, you forgot the rights. Oh, and by the way, gas prices are too high. They were listened to. Okay. Oh, maybe not on gas prices. I'm getting confused. Okay. And some of their smartest leaders eventually found their way into the Constitution's highest post, from the presidency on down. People who opposed the Constitution become President of the United States: James Monroe, Vice President of the United States, Elbridge Gerry, George Clinton, Supreme Court justices. Wow. Wow. They're not voted off the island, you see. Appeals range from the extremely erudite to the stunningly simple. Two sites of conversation, newspapers and conventions, framed the debate, and the dynamic interaction between these sites defined a truly new world model of American-style constitutionalism. Okay, so, those are a few excerpts. What do you want to talk about? And there's a microphone that Lee may bring down, so because we're recording this. So how about right over here, Lee?
Just real quick, I'm a public school teacher, and I do have my students read the Brutus and Federalist Papers, so that just
Great.
wanted to throw that out there for you.
Thank
okay?
you. Thank you. But if I want to just push back just a bit, you have them read Brutus presumably on judicial review, right?
Brutus 1 and Fed 10.
Yes. Okay, so here's what I got to tell you. No one at the time reads Federalist 10. No one. If you had a good argument for why we should actually move away from individual states to an indivisible continental union, it's totally democratic, the likes of which have never before been seen in history. No democracy in history has ever spanned, such a scope. If you had a good argument for that, Would you wait till your 10th newspaper op-ed to make it? Of course you wouldn't. So, I gotta be straight with you. No one at the time reads Federalist 10. No one. No one reads Federalist 10 for the next 100 years. No one. And they read the Federalist Papers, but they don't read Federalist 10. They read other Federalist Papers. I highlight especially 4 to 6 and 8. Those are the ones that are reprinted. So why do you teach Federalist 10? Because you don't even, I'm going to be strict, I'm pushing back. You don't even know why you read Federalist 10, and I do. Because there was a guy, who's an Ivy League professor, and he wrote the most influential book on the Constitution of the last century. His name was Charles Beard, and his book is an economic interpretation of the Constitution. And whether you're aware of it or not, he had a tremendous influence on generations of scholars who wrote the textbooks who influenced you. And he said, Constitution was a coup pulled off by, behind closed doors by the 1% who are trying to protect, actually, their economic interests, pushing back against the masses who, and the democratic overexuberance of Shays' Rebellion. So they met in secret, behind closed doors, led by a revolutionary general, a bunch of fat cats, of and by the 1%. None of this is true, you see. Because they put it to a vote, and it doesn't say we the property, and I just told you it doesn't do we the property, and Beard knew some of those facts and hid them from his reader, but Federalist 10 was his Exhibit A because Madison talks about class issue in America. He talks about rich and poor, and says, aha, this is Marx, as in Karl, avant la lettre, aha, aha. Okay, so that's why you're teaching him 10, which is not actually what the debate was really all about. So I'm being straight with you. The most important books on the Constitution of this century are also written by an Ivy League professor. But he's not at Columbia, he's at Yale. I know who I am. I'm not a BS person. This is either true or it's not. If it's not true, you shouldn't have me back 6 times. But if it is true, damn it, actually you have to read this book and its predecessor, America's Constitutional Biography, because I want you to teach them the Federalist, anti-Federalist conversation, but actually Federalist 10 is not where it's at. There's a different argument for union, and it's the heart of my books, and it's about geostrategy and war and all the rest. So I love it that you're teaching primary sources, but this is so 20th century of you. Look, I came here to actually tell you lots of stuff that you were taught, it's not quite, it doesn't matter whether it's July 2nd or July 4th. It doesn't really matter that they weren't all in a room when they signed the thing. But it really does matter why people voted for the Constitution, and no one pays any attention to Federalist 10. And by the way, James Madison is not the father of the Constitution, and I make a big deal of that, and it's obvious. By the time you finish the book, you will not wonder, whether James Madison, the father of the Constitution, because the father is George Washington, you'll wonder how you could have ever thought otherwise, okay? Because James Madison, let's just take a step back. Point 1, the guy is 5'4". People do not pay attention to short people. I speak from experience here, okay? Joking aside, every American has heard of George Washington. He has the only army on the continent, and he walks away from all power. Let me actually, Derek, let me find my clicker here. We can show him a picture. This is the most important, one of the most important moments in world history. Let's just see here. Let's go to image. Keep scrolling down. It's going to be like image 20 or so. A bunch of snakes here. I don't like snakes. They scare the heck out of me. But, okay, it's image 16. Okay. Here is George Washington. This is another Trumbull handing over his military commission. You see that it's counterpart to the Declaration one. Remember Thomas Jefferson in the middle of that other one? It's his hand on the Declaration. here it's, again, Washington's hand, but his sword is actually on his left, the hand of power. He's surrendering his commission. That chair, it's metaphoric. That's a throne that he's spurning. He could make himself emperor. He could be just like Caesar and grab all power. Like Darius, Darius, or Xerxes. He could name himself Lord Protector, as Cromwell did. Napoleon, within a couple of decades, is going to grab the crown from the hands of the Pope and put it on his own head. George Washington is the greatest man in the world because he gives up an army. No one's heard of James Madison. Washington is the unanimously selected president of the Philadelphia Convention. He gets every single thing he wants, and Madison gets nothing distinctive that he wants. People vote for the Constitution's big new idea is a strong executive. Madison doesn't even understand executive power. Even later on when he's president, that's why the Capitol burns to the ground on his watch. Not so cool. People vote for the Constitution because Washington is for it. He's the unanimously elected first president. Every elector votes for him. He's the unanimously re-elected first president. And no one is paying any attention to James Madison. Madison is influential only because Washington enlists his aid. There are only 55 people at Philadelphia at any point. 39 signed the Constitution at the end. There are 12 state delegations. Rhode Island doesn't show up. 5 of the people at Philadelphia in 5 different delegations are Washington's law clerks, so to speak. They're his aides de camp in 5 different states. Hamilton from New York, and McHenry from Maryland, and Pinckney, Charles Cotesworth from South Carolina, and Randall from Virginia, and I've forgotten blocking on the 5th, but it'll come to me. So it's Washington's Constitution overwhelmingly. James Madison is not where it's at. No one's paying any attention to him. Federalist 10 is not important at all. Other Federalist papers are, and they are Washingtonian and Hamiltonian and geostrategic. So I love it that you're actually teaching stuff, primary sources, but you've been influenced by Beard, who is, in my view, bunk.
We'll have to talk, because I'm also a James Madison Fellow.
Yeah, and that's, and part of that is the problem, because if James Madison were alive today, do you know what his name would be? Okay, Federalist 10, pro-party or anti-party?
Pro-party, anti-teaching.
No, it's anti-faction. It says factions are bad.
It's just mischiefs of factions.
Yeah, okay. James Madison, factions are bad, parties are bad. Who founds the oldest continuous political party in America? His name is James Madison, 10 years later, okay? So, James Madison, and at the end, he actually sides with his party over truth and justice. He and Jefferson start out saying we should prohibit slavery in the territories, and at the end of their life, they're actually pushing slavery in the territories because he becomes a party man. If he were alive today, his name would be Kevin McCarthy. His name would not be Liz Cheney. And I understand there are reasons to pick party. If you think the other party is evil, you're going to stick with your party, okay? But if you teach Federalist 10, you're getting, in my view, that's not actually who James Madison is in the entirety of his career. It's not actually how the American Constitution plays out. It's not what the ratification, in fact, was all about. You got to read the book. I'm being very serious here because I'm actually calling into question the standard narratives that have dominated historiography for the last 100 years.
Okay, do you foresee inevitable repeal of the Electoral College? And if so, by what processes? And secondly, what about the unfortunate section of the 13th Amendment? Do we have to repeal the entire amendment, or can that certain bad section be excised?
Okay, how many of you have heard of, there's this idea, it's kind of screwy, truthfully, but it's going to try to achieve direct national election without a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment is very difficult. You need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. So there's this idea that if a whole bunch of individual states choose to give their electoral votes to the person who wins the national popular vote, then we could do it that way. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's a little bit of a screwy idea. How many of you have heard of it? Okay, I invented it. I'm not making that Derek, if you just want to just go on the internet, and just put up a National Popular Vote Interstate Compact and then do a Control F for Amar. It's called the Amar Plan. And I'm not sure I'm in favor of it. Okay? Because it actually has some real glitches to it, truthfully. I invented it sitting in my bathtub like Archimedes, and I thought this would be like an interesting, cool. I just put it up on the internet just because I thought it was like an interesting idea, having no thought that people would actually listen to me on this, because I hadn't really thought it through. Here are some of the problems with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
But how many states already passed it?
We're already at about states totaling, I think, 190 or so electoral votes you need to get to 270. Derek, are you there? Up there? Yeah. Okay, so just go on Wikipedia and just put in National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It will tell us how many, you can just switch files here, how many states have, I'll look it up myself down here. Connecticut, I think, has actually joined the thing. They did not ask me to testify. If they had, I would have actually said, ooh, it's complicated. Okay, so how many states here? How many Popular Vote Interstate Compact? It says, as of the current nanosecond,
195 up there.
we're at 195, and we need 270. And if you do a Control F, Yale Law School professor Akil, one of the compact's founders, has blah, blah, blah. Okay, you see that? I'm not making it up. Just Control F for Amar. A-M-A-R. Okay. There we go. When I had black hair. My gray hair, I tell people it's hereditary. My kids gave it to me. But anyway, there's some problems with it. I'll tell you some problems. First, how are you going to get a complete, accurate count of the national popular vote? Because suppose some states don't want to play ball and they won't. Let's say the national popular vote is actually pretty close, but some states are not close. And those states say, we're not going to retabulate because our state isn't close and we don't believe in this. So what happens, do you really, who's going to sort of, in order to do this right, the big idea of the national popular vote is treating every vote equally. But is that going to work? Because states actually are different. Let's say, for example, California says, the more Californians vote, then the bigger we're going to loom in a national tally, so we're going to let 17-year-olds vote. And Texas says, okay, well, we're going to let 16-year-olds vote. And Arkansas says, okay, well, we're going to let dogs vote. And you're going to need national rules to administer a national election with national uniformity. Now, who's going to administer that? In 2020, would that be Donald Trump? Because he's the President of the United States in charge of a national system. So it turns out that I had this idea, it was kind of interesting, it has some complexities to it. I still believe in one person, one vote. It's a deep idea, it's how we pick our governors, but there are going to be some complexities if we try to do that to pick our presidents. So I want you, my fellow citizens, to be aware of the best argument for it, equality. One person, one vote. It's how we pick governors in every state. We don't have little mini electoral colleges. 80% of the arguments you hear for the electoral college, I just showed you, are bunk. Because if they were smart, if they were good, Texas would have a little mini electoral college for its governorship, and so would California, so would Connecticut, so would Pennsylvania, and we don't do it that way. Oh, we can't do it because recounts are such a problem. Well, we manage it in most states. Or, the cities would have too much weight. Well, LA, San Francisco, Houston, and these city memes are actually sometimes racially coded, you see. So 80% of the arguments aren't very good, because if they were good, why do states have one person, one vote? But I'm giving you some arguments that are a little more complex as a matter of federalism, because states have different regimes of voting, how we do it. And some states have, 3 weeks of voting, other states, 1 day. If you're going to have one person, one vote nationally, you're going to kind of, I think, need, national uniformity of a certain sort. Who's going to administer that system? So that's the complexity. 13th Amendment, I think what you're talking about, and it's volume 2, is that slavery is permissible as punishment for a crime where one has been duly convicted. But at a certain point, we do put people behind bars if they're convicted of bad things, and sometimes we make them. They're getting 3 squares and a cot at public expense, so we make them try to pay for the cost of their own incarceration. So I'm not sure that we would try to repudiate that in general. The language of the 13th Amendment comes directly from the language of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and I talk about the Northwest Ordinance in some detail in Chapter 4. It's an amazing Charter of Liberty alongside the Declaration of Independence and state constitutions and the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And most of you probably don't know a lot about the Northwest Ordinance. It prohibits slavery in the territories. It's the young Thomas Jefferson's great idea, just eliminate slavery in the territories, and James Madison is with him then. And that's why it's so sad that at the end of their lives, Jefferson and Madison are pushing slavery into the territories and opposing the Missouri Compromise of 1819 and 1820. So James Madison and his biographers don't tell you that story. And neither do Thomas Jefferson's and the James. So I gave a lecture to the James Madison Fellows this summer. It's on YouTube. And I go after James Madison good and hard in that lecture. Okay? Because on slavery, this is the last chapter of the book, Washington frees his slaves at the end, Jefferson and Madison not so much. Okay, more questions. Lee, why don't you pick someone? You have someone pretty close?
I think it would be great to... I will pick up my mask.
And then the next one is behind you, because I saw your hand up as well.
Okay.
With the red sweater.
One of the hot election issues ahead of us is this independent state legislature case. And I had the privilege of reading the amicus brief that you and your brother and Professor Calabresi wrote,
yes,
which I thought really nailed it. And I just think it'd be fun for everyone to hear where you come out on that issue and why.
Yeah, it's a white hot. Nina Totenberg referred to this as a scorching brief. Okay, set the stage. Independent state legislature. What's that all about? It's John Eastman on steroids. It's an idea. It's now before the Supreme Court that state legislatures, if they want, can pick the electors themselves and screw the voters. Even in states whose state constitutions say the voters pick presidential electors or congressional the voters make the rules for congressional districting. There are several states that have red legislatures but who voted blue presidentially. I'm talking about states like Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, and until recently Michigan, until recently Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. These are states, to repeat, that because of urban clustering, gerrymandering, a whole bunch of other things, have Republican legislatures but voted presidentially blue, one person, one vote. If these state legislatures are allowed to pick presidential electors themselves, no Democrat can win. And they're claiming they have an absolute right to do so because the Constitution says the legislature gets to decide. Who cares about state constitutions? Well, I care about state constitutions because the American revolutionaries cared about state constitutions, and I'll read you a passage that's in this brief. I'll read it to you in a minute. So this is a case before the Supreme Court, and it's called the Independent State Legislature Theory. The case is called Moore versus Harper. It's about congressional districting, but it has implications for presidential elections. now. It's being argued on December 7th. I just called the court this morning and asked if, I called Justice Breyer's chambers and asked if they could get me a ticket. Because I wrote this amicus brief and I'd like to be there to show the flag. Here's the thing about the amicus brief. Amicus means friend, amicus. We're a friend of the court. There are 3 people that signed this brief. Yours truly, my brother, who's a dean and law professor in Illinois, clerk for the Supreme Court way back when, and wait for it, the co-founder and national chairman of the Federalist Society. Okay, so this is not a partisan thing. And I think my friend Steve Calabrese has a lot of credibility with the justices. So we wrote this brief. Nina Totenberg, our friend, tweeted out, oh, we've got a free weekly podcast. It's free. You can listen to it. Nina's going to be a guest in upcoming weeks. Stephen Breyer's going to be a guest. We've had Bob Woodward and Neil Katyal and Gary Hart and Linda Greenhouse and all sorts of really cool people as guests. We don't always have guests. But Nina Totenberg tweeted out when we filed this amicus brief, referring to it as scorching, and it really goes after the other side, good and hard, including the fact that they cited a phony historical document to the United States Supreme Court. They just filed a reply brief a few hours ago. I haven't been able to open it up because you know what? Cell service and Wi-Fi here ain't so good. So I'm gonna open it up tonight and read it. But apparently they do not apologize for their fraud on the court. We will see. So the amicus brief is free for you all to read. All you have to do is go on the U.S. Supreme Court website and you can find it. We have this free, I say weekly podcast. This is Dr. Andrew Lipka and yours truly. He's a retired ophthalmologist. He's just like you all. He's not some legal expert. It's about an hour and a half every week. Next week will be our 100th episode. And to repeat, it's free. It's got a cutesy name, America's Constitution. But you can just put in Akil Amar podcast. What's a podcast? I actually really didn't know what a podcast was when we started. It's just an audio clip that you can listen to. It's about an hour and a half every week, and we talk about constitutional issues. We have several episodes on ISL, Independent State Legislature Theory, what it is and why it matters. But just to repeat, if ISL is embraced by the Supreme Court, state legislatures in places like Wisconsin and Arizona and Georgia can simply say, we will pick the presidential electors ourselves. Who cares about the voters? Even in states where state constitutions say the voters pick. Now, why do I think state constitutions are important? Let me just read you a passage. We quote it in the brief. This is a chapter called We. It's chapter 4. For all their anxiety, Americans also thrilled at the prospect before them. This is 1776. We have every opportunity, wrote Thomas Paine in the stirring closing passage of Common Sense, to form the noblest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah. Here's John Adams. You and I, he writes a friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to have lived. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government for themselves or their children, when before the present moment, had 3 millions of people full power and fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest governments that human wisdom can contrive. And were they talking about continental government? No, not yet. They're talking about each state being able to govern itself. Here's what John writes to Abigail. I told you they vote independence on July 2nd. They vote for a document on July 4th. But the real Independence Day is actually a month and a half earlier. It's when the Continental Congress votes to recommend to each state that each state adopt its own constitution free from British control. Here's what on May 17, and John Adams is the one who pushes this resolution through. This is page 152. On May 17, 1776, so this is well before July, John wrote Abigail, he had just successfully championed a two-part resolution urging each colony to form its own government, its own constitution, entirely free from any political or legal connection to George III or Britain. This resolution, he explained with a mixture of pride and awe, was tantamount to, quote, absolute independence, unquote. So here's what he says. A whole government of our own choice in Massachusetts, managed by persons whom we love, revere, and can confide in, has charms in it for which men will fight. They're fighting for the ability of each state to have its own constitution, which will tell the legislature what to do. Back to now Akil's prose. To find the true meaning of American independence, circa 1776, we must thus look beyond the Continental Congress. We will not find all the answers to the meaning of 1776 in documents that fully emerged only years later, like the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance, the ultimate federal constitution. Those are years later. No, if we are to understand what all the shouting was about in 1776, what the main point of the conversation was, we must first ponder the state constitutions that sprouted like so many daffodils up and down the continent in the springtime of the New World. I quote that language and John Adams' language in this scorching brief because I say, if you do not understand the central significance of state constitutions to the revolutionary generation, you don't understand anything about the American saga. Now let's just hope the Supreme Court listens. This gentleman right with the brownish sweater, you had your hand up also? Or, yeah.
Just to go to the present even more, I mean, do you feel there's a danger to the Constitution standing as a unifying document when judges seemingly ignore long-term decisions, throw out decisions that have been in effect for 50 years, and seemingly are really contemptuous of prior courts, prior judges, and we wait to see the next election as to what the Constitution's going to mean because they'll put in their folks to further their agenda.
Oh, you mean Brown v. Board of Education overruling 50 years of precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson? Oh no, maybe you mean in 1937 the court tossing out all 50 years of precedent overprotecting property and contract. Oh no, maybe you mean actually in 1963 the Warren Court kicking in high gear and throwing out precedent after precedent after precedent in the name of the Constitution. No, I'm not in agreement with you. I believe that what we pay, what judges and everyone else has to take an oath to is the Constitution of the United States, not the precedents, okay? And you will not, I'm being straight with you. The precedents have often been bad, and the court has tossed them overboard. Here's what they have to do if they're going to toss them overboard. They have to prove that the precedents were wrong. But if the precedents are wrong, the Supremacy Clause says this Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And now, oh, my fellow Americans, you're going to actually have to know what the Constitution actually says, to know whether the judges are actually doing what they're supposed to do or whether they're full of shit. Oh, hang on. You asked me a question. Hand the microphone. I'm not back to someone else. Hand it back. There we go. Okay. So I'm fierce on this. Okay. So you will not be able to do your. So I'm saying I disagree with you. You know, the supreme law is our Constitution. You have to read it. Now, I'm being straight with you. You can't fully know what it understands just reading the thing. You have to read the damn book. You just do. You don't have to agree with it, but you cannot discharge your responsibilities as citizens unless you actually are familiar with this document. I have spent years of my life doing nothing other than thinking about this. If you read the books, you will know more than I knew before I wrote these books. You'll know about 2/3 of what I know today. I've got two brothers. One's a law professor. He joined this scorching brief. The other is he's the smart one. He's a neurosurgeon. He's a brain surgeon. There's no way he could write a book about brain surgery that I could read and then I could start operating on people, okay? That's just not how neurosurgery works or rocket science works. But it is how constitutional law works. It's actually designed for ordinary people. They wrote it, they ratified it, they amended it, and you can actually engage the thing, but you actually have to do a little bit more work, and you can't just say, because it's just too easy, oh, they have to follow precedent. Because they didn't in 1937. They didn't, and that was, it's called the switch in time that saved the night. Franklin Roosevelt put people on the court to stop overprotecting property and contract. It was a thing called the Lochner era. And in 1954, the Supreme Court said separate but equal is bullshit because it's actually not equal, and this says equal. And in 1963, the Warren Court kicks into high gear, and here's a quote from a very famous law professor. The list of cases overruled by the Warren Court looks like a table of contents of the Constitutional Law Casebook, circa 1953, okay? And I'm not opposed to what the Warren Court did. I'm not opposed to in 1963. I'm not opposed to what the court did in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. I'm not opposed to what the court did in 1937. Here's the obligation of the court. If you're going to toss precedents overboard, you better be sure that you're doing so because the Constitution actually says X and the precedents are inconsistent with that. Now, you're probably upset about Casey being overturned and Roe being overturned in the Dobbs case. Maybe not, but that's maybe what you're talking about. So I'll be straight with you. I'm pro-choice and Roe is not well-reasoned. My brother clerked for Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe versus Wade, okay? But the Constitution is not what my personal politics are. The Constitution is what it is, and as a scholar, I'm going to read it and tell you what it really said and why it really said that. And if the cases are inconsistent with the Constitution, we've got to go with the Constitution. And if you don't like it, then you have to amend the Constitution. And on a choice, if you don't like what the court is doing, you have to vote. And because because states can protect reproductive rights above what they have to, what the minimum is, and when a whole bunch of states do certain things, that creates actually the conditions for protecting unenumerated rights. And in the books, I tell you how unenumerated rights emerge, and they emerge in part because elections actually matter. So, Griswold versus Connecticut. Let me just take two cases. Griswold versus Connecticut is about a right of contraception. Here's the key point. It's from this state. Connecticut was the only state in America that ever made it a crime to use contraception in the home. It was a weird outlier law, and the Supreme Court said, there are unenumerated rights. How do we find them? By looking at state practices. 49 states have never criminalized contraception in the home. Connecticut's law is un-American. Now, let me tell you about the facts of Roe versus Wade. And to repeat, my brother clerked for Harry Blackmun, not that year, but and we love Harry Blackmun, but he invalidated the laws of not one state, not two states, but of 49 states. There was only one state in the Union that met Roe's trimester framework. That was New York. Every other state had rules that Blackmun invalidated, and if you're going to do that, you better show me something pretty clear in the Constitution. And Blackmun couldn't quite do that. Today, my party, I'm pro-choice personally, controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and today we can't even pass a law that just codifies as a matter of statute some of the principles of Roe versus Wade. Now, how are we going to read this into the Constitution when there's never even been sufficient consensus on this to just get a statute when the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, controls House, Senate, and presidency? I do not worship a precedent. My loyalty is to the Constitution, and it's a more democratic text than the precedents. You can't master all the precedents. You can actually master the Constitution. You can read it in an hour. This book will take you 10, 15 hours to read, and you will know more about the Constitution than I knew before I wrote the book. Now you see, why it matters whether we have a literate, educated citizenry that understands the Constitution or not. It can't be about the precedents. And I say that as someone who knows almost all the justices. Several are, pretty close friends. But you can't just let them say anything they want and call it the Constitution. You can't, whether they're on the left or the right. There was questions up there. And while Lee is getting there, there's one down. Okay, then let's get them up in that corner next. Okay, please.
Thank you. Connecticut is the Constitution state.
Mm-hmm.
But our Constitution, which you're putting so much emphasis on the state's Constitution,
Mm-hmm.
is not based on the U.S. Constitution since it's predated the U.S. Constitution. It's based on the Magna Carta.
No.
Oh, so could you clarify that? Because
So
some
the
of it is-
Connecticut Constitution, Connecticut is one of 2 states that in the American Revolution does not adopt a new constitution. 11 states do. We continue to be governed under a charter that came from King Charles, and Rhode Island is the other state. But we adopt in Connecticut a new constitution in 1818. And Rhode Island does so in the 1840s in a thing called Dora's Rebellion. Connecticut now is like the other states. It has a homegrown American Constitution, popular sovereignty style.
And
And don't think Magna Carta is so great. It wasn't. It was just one group of thugs making a deal with another thug on a battlefield, not even written in English. It says judgment of peers. That people say that means trial by jury. It doesn't mean trial by jury. They're still having trials by ordeal in battle at the time. It's about barons and kings.
it's still kind of amazing that a lot of our laws were based on that.
Well, that's what they'll tell you in Britain, but don't believe that.
Going back to your compact clause and your that Connecticut passed that was very interesting that your involvement in that. I was a legislator at the time and voted for that and and advocated for that. And a lot of people in this room wrote me letters asking me to support that. But we do not invite people to come and testify to hearings. We don't invite people to come vote.
Why?
On election day.
And why wouldn't you? Because
It's a public hearing, and so
yeah. I mean,
it's not by invitation.
Well, I testified, so that's bad. I've testified before Congress on many occasions at the invitation of both parties because actually, sometimes experts know stuff.
Right. But we don't hear it. It's you follow the process, and when the laws are coming up for proposed bills are coming up, and they're advertised, and people can come and testify. But we don't send out invitations to people.
I think that's a mistake, and that's not how most states do it. And that's not how Congress
We don't
does it.
send out invitations.
Yeah, I know. I hear you. But I'm telling you, I think that doesn't make sense.
Could you comment on, I may have this wrong, on what I understand attempts to be to use the 14th Amendment to declare fetal personhood and therefore outlaw abortion across the United States?
Yeah, that's edgy because the Constitution's 14th Amendment begins with this amazing sentence. I love this sentence. And it has an interesting word in it. The word is born. And it's a riff on the Declaration of Independence, the word created. So the 14th Amendment's first sentence says that all persons, actually I'm going to just, because I've got too many things in my hand here. The 14th Amendment's first sentence, which is about overruling the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott said blacks can never be citizens. 14th Amendment says, oh yes they can. Everyone born in the United States is a citizen. Here's the sentence. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state whereof they reside. It's an idea of everyone's born a citizen. Everyone's born a full and equal citizen. We're all born equal. We're all created equal. We're born equal, black or white. We're born equal, male or female. We're born equal, gay or straight. We're born equal, Jew or Gentile. We're born equal, in wedlock or out of wedlock. It's a powerful idea, this birth equality idea. It appears in most state constitutions in the founding period, and I talk about that in chapter 4. This idea that Lincoln is riffing on all these themes of birth and rebirth when he talks about America's a new birth of freedom in the Gettysburg Address. And he's riffing on the Declaration, which talks about created equal. Now, created, when were you created? Maybe actually conception or a fetal heartbeat or something like that. But the Constitution actually uses a really key word. It's born. Persons are born citizens. I'm born a citizen of the United States because in Ann Arbor, Michigan, my parents weren't citizens at the time. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who your parents are. Whether they're here as citizens, or my parents were actually medical students, whether they're here legally or illegally. Everyone born in America is born a birthright citizen. But I think it's much edgier to try to confer full-blown constitutional personhood on people who aren't yet born, especially if you're trying to do so in ways that restrict rights of fully born folk. All that said, you might want to listen to a podcast episode where I have my friend, the great Nadine Strawston, who was for 20 years president of ACLU, and we both agree, and she and I are both pro-choice, that you could imagine a proper law being passed saying, not vis-a-vis the mother, but vis-a-vis other folks, the intentional snuffing out of a life of an unborn entity could be treated as tantamount to murder. Here's the hypothetical that we have in mind. A desperately wanted pregnancy by a woman. She's very visibly showing pregnant. Someone shoots into her belly, either the biological father or someone who knows that he's not the biological father, with the intent of snuffing out that entity. That's an assault on her, of course, an invasion of her body, but it's also, it can be treated, Nadine and I believe, as a second crime against the unborn entity. Whether you call it a person or not, we can, I don't mean to be unduly, snarky or provocative, we can make it a crime to visit cruelty upon animals, and we do, and all sorts of other entities. And you could believe all that, as I do and Nadine does, and be very strongly pro-choice, because it's one thing to say that that entity has rights against the rest of the world, which it does. It's very different to say it has rights against the mother who is nurturing it and in whose body it resides, and whom may herself have all sorts of complicated medical situations that need to be attended to and the like. So I've said 2 points. One, the Constitution says born, and that's actually an important word, especially if you're going to try to create rights against women, against mothers. But second, for certain purposes, you might treat, let's take, an entity that's 32 weeks post-conception, fully viable, and someone tries to end its existence against the will of the mother. Can you treat that as a homicide of sorts? Nadine and I think you can, and you might find that episode of the podcast kind of interesting.
Thank you for answering our questions. I have a 3-part question here.
So I'm going to have to remember 3 parts, and I'm getting old. Okay.
You'll get it. What are your thoughts about the major questions doctrine and its tension with Chevron?
Oh my God, okay.
Two.
You just lost 90% of the audience, but okay. Okay.
Where do you think the current court with its conservative majority is going with this, and do you think they're going to overturn Chevron or overrule it, excuse me? And 3, do
do you agree with my proposition that the current glorification of this so-called major questions doctrine is just fake news, so to speak, by the conservative majority to dismantle the administrative state for their corporate and ultra-wealthy taskmasters?
So this is a very technical but important question about the administrative state. And there's this thing called Chevron. It's a case that said that judges should generally defer to administrative agencies on certain things where the administrative agencies are expert. And judges today, justices are saying, oh no, actually these bureaucrats are running wild, they're making all sorts of rules that are very intrusive, and we shouldn't defer to the EPA, the OSHA, the SEC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, lots of agencies. We shouldn't defer to them on major questions, big issues, whether tobacco is a drug or not. We shouldn't defer to the FDA on a really big question. Maybe technical questions, yes, but really big questions we shouldn't defer, because there's this idea of the major question doctrine, that certain really important things we shouldn't attribute to the legislature, the Congress, an intent lightly to have an unelected agency decide a major issue of public policy. So this is called the major question doctrine, and the question is, what's going to happen to it? One big proponent of it is Neil Gorsuch. There are others. They tend to be on the conservative wing of the court. My own thought is this might be over. This was at the heart of a case involving the EPA and regulation of certain kinds of pollution in the West Virginia case at the end of last term. My own view is, I'm not sure we need some big fancy new doctrine, but here is an ancient idea, and it's true even in situations that don't involve administrative agencies. It's a little maxim, and the maxim is, elephants do not hide in mouse holes. If something is a really big effect legally, you should expect to see lots of evidence for it, let's say in the legislature, if they're trying to do something really big, like treating tobacco as a drug or something like that. In this ISL brief, that amicus brief that I just filed with Vic Amar and Steve Calabresi, in the second paragraph, the third paragraph of our brief, we actually say, elephants don't hide in mouse holes, yet petitioners would have us believe that T-Rexes lurk in insect holes. By which we meant, gee, if the framers of the Constitution meant to make state legislatures independent of the state constitutions that created those legislatures and limit those legislatures, oh boy, we'd expect to see a lot of evidence for that, because that's a really big, that would be a really big thing, given their the founders' belief in state constitutions. If they were going to try to put state legislatures above state constitutions, we should expect to see a lot of evidence of that, and we see none.
First of all, this is fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
During Justice Kavanaugh's hearings, you were an advocate of his as being extraordinarily qualified.
Yes.
Maybe the most qualified that any potential justice that President Trump could appoint to the court.
Right.
He was obviously confirmed.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view his opinions as a Supreme Court justice relative to what perhaps your expectations
Great,
have been?
thank you. And that's really honest. So, I'm a Democrat. I voted for Hillary Clinton. Before her, Barack Obama twice. I voted for Joe Biden. But now I get to be straight with you. When my team loses both the presidency and the Senate, which it did in the 2016 election, my options are going to be very limited. I'm going to get very, very candidly, because we're talking about kind of generational passings of the baton. I'm going to get a Kennedy clerk or a Scalia clerk. That's what I'm going to get. Many of the justices, basically, increasingly in this world, actually clerked for previous generations of justices. I clerked for Steve Breyer. He clerked for Arthur Goldberg. Of the current Supreme Court justices, John Roberts clerked for, he's Chief Justice, he clerked for a Chief Justice, William Rehnquist. And Amy Coney Barrett clerked for Antonin Scalia. And Neil Gorsuch clerked for Byron Wright and Anthony Kennedy. And Kavanaugh clerked for Kennedy. And Ketanji Brown Jackson clerked for Breyer. And some of the others who did clerk for justices clerked for judges, like Sam Alito for Judge Garth. So here are my choices, quite candidly. If my party loses the presidency in the Senate, I'm going to get a Kennedy clerk or a Scalia clerk. And I prefer a Kennedy clerk, because Kennedy was better on issues like same-sex marriage, gay rights. Kennedy, I think, was better on, more moderate on affirmative action. Kennedy, in my view, was better on unenumerated rights in all sorts of ways. So, on the list of, so Trump was going to pick from a list, and I knew a lot of the judges on that list. And some of them were my friends. One of them, my brother was a groomsman in his wedding. I liked these folks. I actually thought Kennedy was the best on that list. Kavanaugh, was the best on that list. And if I didn't get Kavanaugh, I know who was on deck. It was Amy Coney Barrett, and I like her exceedingly, but she is much closer in certain respects to the person for whom she clerked, who is Antonin Scalia, who was very bad on gay rights issues, for example. And so it's not about who I like personally. It's just about who I think has the better constitutional vision. Now, how has it played out, is what you're asking me. And the most honest answer is, this ISL case will be a very big test. And I'm hoping, who knows, that Brett Kavanaugh will be the fifth vote to uphold my position, the liberal position. Steve Calabrese, co-founder of the Federalist Society position on ISL. We will see. I can tell you, let's take two cases that got a lot of attention. I'm surprised I didn't get asked a question about guns, but I'll bring it in this final answer. Let's take the Dobbs case, that was about Roe versus Wade and Casey, and let's take the Bruen case, that was about guns. Let's compare, actually, the Trump justices, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. In Dobbs, which overruled Roe and overruled Casey, Kavanaugh writes a concurring opinion saying, actually, it's really important to recognize that even with this decision, women have a right to travel, to go to other jurisdictions and procure procedures that are legal in those other jurisdictions. No other justice in the five-member coalition, the majority, joined Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh was the most moderate of the five. Not a word from my friend Amy Coney Barrett or Neil Gorsuch. Alito wrote the opinion, and Clarence Thomas, was with him in every word, and Gorsuch and Barrett. Kavanaugh joined it, but he actually wrote a concurrence that was softer and more moderate. And if you listen to the podcast, we had 9 episodes on Dobbs, and we were actually saying, here are ways of trying to soften the leaked draft. And Kavanaugh took a couple of those paths, actually. So he talks about, I think Kavanaugh also was more clear in his concurrence that if Congress passes a freedom of choice statute, he will uphold that freedom of choice statute. He says we're leaving it to the political process, and the political process can protect abortion by a mere statute. And today, my party controls the House, the Senate, the presidency, and they haven't passed such a statute. But Kavanaugh signaled he would uphold it, not a word from the others on that side. So I think, okay, that was, now the second one is Bruin. It's about guns and the right to carry weapons in public. And once again, Kavanaugh writes a concurrence. Justice Kennedy used to do this all the time, right? These concurrences that limited the sweep to some extent of the more expansive, more extreme majority opinion. And even though Kennedy, because Anthony Kennedy's one of the most polite people you will ever meet. He's a real sweetie. And so he's agreeable, he'll join the opinion, but then he'll write separately that actually cuts back on it to some extent. And if he's the fifth vote, then he's signaling actually that that's really, in effect, the effective majority. Here's what Kavanaugh wrote in Bruin. It's a 3-page concurrence, and 4 separate times. He's joined in this one by John Robertson, not by Amy Coney Barrett or by Gorsuch. He says, here's the key to the case. The key to this case is that, and it's consistent with what I was telling you before, New York's law is an outlier. There are only 6 states in the country that have an extreme law that gives government so much discretion about whether people can carry guns in public. In New York, basically, the government has to decide whether you have a good enough reason to have a gun, and that's not how we usually think about constitutional rights. You have to persuade them you have a good enough reason to open up a printing press, or a good enough reason to hire a lawyer or something. We don't, and government had a lot of discretion in doing that, and rich and powerful people in Manhattan often got their gun permit, and other people live in sketchy neighborhoods, and they have reason to want guns when they're walking to and from their shop or something like that, from home to shop. We're not actually given gun permits. If we had that rule for toasters, you have to come up with a good enough a reason to get a toaster, we'd be skeptical, just on kind of due process and fairness grounds. Now, I need to tell you, I've never owned a gun. I'm not a gun person at all. But I'm trying to understand in a fair way what the strongest constitutional arguments are on the other side. I believe in lots of gun control. But I also believe that there are unenumerated rights in America, even if there were no Second Amendment at all. There are unenumerated rights. Where do they come from? I told you. They come from state practices. In Griswold, there was an unenumerated right to use contraception in the home because 49 states had recognized that. There was one outlier. This was a case not about guns in the home, but 2 earlier cases were about guns in the home. Here's the way to understand my point. Even if there were no Second Amendment, there are unenumerated rights. They come from state practice. Liberals believe in sex in the home. That's Griswold. Conservatives believe in guns in the home. I say, this is America. Give them both what they want. Personally, I prefer sex, but whatever floats your boat. Okay? Now, here's what Kavanaugh says in his concurrence. This New York law, which wasn't just about homes, is an outlier statute. There are only 6 states that have laws like this. Actually, he didn't say 6, he said there were 43 states on the other side. You might say that doesn't add up to 50. Professor Vermont actually had a slightly weird variant of the thing. 4 times in 3 pages, Kavanaugh says this is an outlier statute, and so maybe all sorts of other statutes could pass muster. He's softening the majority opinion, and he's joined by the chief, and without those 2, there are not actually 5 votes on the conservative bloc. So in the 2 of the 3 biggest cases at the end of the term, the Dobbs case about abortion, overturning Roe and Casey, and the Bruin case about guns, I think Kavanaugh positioned himself to the left of Barrett and Gorsuch, the two other Trump appointees. Closer to the chief. He votes with the chief 97 or 98% of the time, according to statistics. That's the highest correlation between any two justices. And the chief is actually, further to the left, as it were, than the others. So I would say so far, I would say my predictions have been borne out. We don't have a lot of data yet. I see him on gay rights issues. Oh, he also went out of his way in his Dobbs concurrence to say Obergefell is absolutely safe. It's an equality argument. It's a same-sex marriage is rock solid. Oh, we didn't hear that from my friend Samuel Alito, and he dissented in Obergefell, and he hasn't made his peace with it. And we didn't hear that from my friend Amy Coney Barrett. So in these two cases, Dobbs, where he actually signaled right to travel, same-sex marriage is safe, and if Congress wants to pass a freedom of choice law, I'll uphold it. Those are three good things. We didn't hear it. He was to the left of silent Barrett and Gorsuch. And in the gun case, where he just said, this is a weird outlier law, maybe other laws that aren't so eccentric, gun control laws, might pass muster. But here's will be the test. The ISL case. We will have to see what especially Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett have to say. I think that, truthfully, I have a better chance of persuading them than I do of Justice Gorsuch, truthfully, for some complex reasons. So that was the calculus that entered. It wasn't about who's my friend, who's not, none of that stuff. Who did I think, in a triage-like way, given that my side lost, who was more likely to be closer to what I think is the better constitutional vision? So is that responsive to what you were asking? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
To read that book. I hope all of you do too. Akil is going to be signing books as you leave, if you want to do that. Thank you very much. Have a great holiday.